She picked up his portfolio and dropped it on the floor of the restaurant without looking at him. Not an accident. Not a fumble. She had been holding it with 2 fingers, the way you hold something you don't want touching your skin, and then she simply let go. The pages scattered across the hardwood. 12 months of design work, 73 photographs, 3 years of renovation projects that had been featured in 2 national shelter magazines, and Colette Arsenault stood over them in her ivory blazer and said, "I think we both know this isn't the level we need." Nolan Ibarra didn't move. He was 38 years old and he had been in rooms like this before. He bent down, gathered the pages without rushing, squared the edges the way Rosa had taught him to care for things worth caring for, and set the portfolio back on the table between them. "I can walk you through anything specific," he said. She wasn't looking at the portfolio anymore. She was looking at him, the particular calibration behind her eyes that he had spent his adult life learning to recognize and had eventually stopped hoping he'd misread. "The thing is," Colette said, "Maison Laurent has a very particular clientele, a certain standard. I'm sure your work is perfectly fine for other projects." A pause she let go too long. "But I'm not sure you have the relevant experience for something at this level." Nolan looked at her for a moment. "Are you certain you want to proceed that way?" She smiled, the kind that doesn't involve the eyes. "I am." He nodded once, said nothing else. She had no idea, not the faintest indication, that the man sitting across from her owned the building Maison Laurent had been operating out of for 9 years. But we'll get to that. Nolan Ibarra was 41 years old, and he had been underestimated so consistently, for so long that he had eventually stopped taking it personally and started treating it as information. He grew up in Scarborough, the second of 4 children, in a house that backed onto a ravine where the sumac went red in October, and his mother Irene kept a kitchen garden that she tended the way other people tend their reputations, carefully, daily, with complete seriousness. His father Joseph ran a small painting and renovation company out of a van for 22 years. Nolan learned to tape drywall before he learned to drive. He could read a blueprint before he finished high school. He understood instinctively what most people had to study for years to approximate, that a room is not furniture and walls. A room is light moving through space at a specific time of day, and the way people feel inside it has almost nothing to do with what the room looks like in a photograph. He got a scholarship to study architecture at Ryerson. He finished top of his cohort. He spent 3 years at a firm in the financial district, doing work that won awards with other people's names on the plaques. He left at 29, opened his own studio in Leslieville, with 2 contract and drafting table he bought secondhand from a retiring engineer in Etobicoke, and spent the following decade building a reputation so quietly that when people finally noticed it, they assumed he'd arrived from somewhere else. He had not arrived from somewhere else. He had been here the whole time. By 37, Nolan Ibarra owned the Whitfield building, a converted warehouse on King Street West. 4 commercial units, original brick, timber ceilings, the kind of bones that architects flew in from other cities to look at. He had purchased it in a transaction handled through a numbered company, the way he handled most things he didn't want to become conversation. The lease agreements were managed by his operations director, a methodical woman named Petra, who had been with him since the Leslieville days, and who had a memory for contract detail that made his attorney mildly anxious. Nolan rarely presented himself as the building's owner to the tenants. He found it created a different dynamic. Not better, just different. And he had learned early that the conversations most worth having were the ones that began without anyone performing for status. He let people form their own impressions. Most of his tenants assumed he was part of the property management company. He had never corrected them. Colette Arsenault had taken the corner unit on the ground floor 11 months ago. Her restaurant, Maison Laurent, was the kind of place that made a magazine cover 2 months after opening, and then spent the next year trying to justify the attention. The food was careful. The room was beautiful. Nolan had designed the renovation himself, quietly through his studio, without introducing himself to the client who would occupy it. Colette had never learned who had drawn the plans. She had hired an interior designer who had subcontracted the architectural work through a firm that Nolan's studio often worked with. The overlap had never surfaced. The catering commission had come through a different channel. Colette was planning a private launch event. A dinner for 60 for the restaurant's first anniversary. A gathering of the kind of people who reviewed things and recommended things and told other people where to eat. She wanted the space redesigned for the evening, custom lighting installation, a reconfigured floor plan, a structural intervention above the bar that would require permits, and an engineer's sign-off. She had found Nolan's studio through a colleague, had requested a portfolio and had arranged a meeting. She had not known when she agreed to the meeting that the man she was meeting had designed the room she was sitting in. His studio lead, a young architect named Farida who had been with him for 3 years and who could sight-read a structural drawing the way musicians sight-read scores, had prepared the portfolio for the presentation. She had worked late 2 nights putting it together. She had included the King Street renovation. This very room, in the portfolio's centerpiece spread, 12 photographs, a full set of construction drawings, the permit history. She had not thought to remove them. There had been no reason to. Nolan had taken the meeting himself because the project was interesting. The intervention above the bar was a problem worth solving. He had reviewed Colette's vision document on the train and had already sketched a preliminary approach in the margins of his notebook by the time he arrived. He sat down at 11 in the morning with a cup of coffee he didn't touch, opened the portfolio and began. Colette let him speak for 4 minutes before she picked up the portfolio and dropped it on the floor. Nolan left the restaurant at 11:20. He walked west on King and found a bench at the small park near the intersection where the old factory had been torn down, and something had grown up in its place that wasn't quite a park, but wasn't quite not one either. He sat for a few minutes. The October air had that particular Toronto sharpness to it, the smell of leaves and cold coming in off the lake. Then he made 2 calls. The first was to Petra, whom he asked to pull Colette Arsenault's lease agreement and cross-reference the conduct provisions in Schedule C. The second was to his attorney, a composed and rather intimidating woman named Sandra who had been handling his real estate matters for 6 years and who answered the phone on the second ring. "Tell me what happened," Sandra said. He told her. There was a brief silence. "She dropped your portfolio on the floor." "Yes, the portfolio that contains photographs of the room she's currently paying you rent to occupy, correct?" Another silence, shorter. "Give me the afternoon. Don't communicate with her directly." Nolan said he wouldn't. He hung up, looked at the park for another moment, then walked back east toward his studio. He did not contact Colette Arsenault that afternoon. He returned to the studio, reviewed the bar installation drawings that Farida had updated overnight, signed off on a permit application for a different project in the annex, and responded to a backlog of emails with the steady attention of someone who had learned that the most effective response to disruption was usually just to keep working. At 3:15, Petra called. "Schedule C? Section 9, she said. Conduct standards and the quiet enjoyment provisions. She's on the wrong side of both, and the portfolio drop? Proper damage is arguable. But discriminatory conduct toward a contractor or building affiliate is explicit. We have a conduct clause that went in during the 2021 renewal. I put it in after the situation with the third-floor tenant. It's specific and it's binding." "Good," Nolan said. "Don't say anything to her yet." He paused. "Petra, does she know who owns the building?" "A beat. She knows the numbered company. She's never asked beyond that." "All right," he said. "I'll go in tomorrow." He spent the rest of the afternoon finishing the structural assessment for the bar project. He had decided at 11:20 that morning on the bench near the old factory site, still a problem worth solving. That hadn't changed. Nolan arrived at Maison Laurent the following morning at 10. He was not wearing the clothes he had worn to the portfolio meeting, the practical jacket and dark wool trousers of a working architect on a site visit. He was wearing a charcoal coat, a clean shirt, the kind of clothes he wore when he was operating as the owner of something, rather than the designer of it. Petra was with him. Sandra had sent a junior associate named Felix who carried a leather folder and said very little. The restaurant wasn't open yet. A young server named Gabriel let them in, confused but polite, and went to find Colette. She emerged from the back in 4 minutes. When she saw Nolan at the bar, she stopped mid-step. "You," she said. "I thought we'd concluded our meeting." "We had," Nolan said. "This is a different meeting." I have prep to oversee. If this is about the portfolio, I've already decided to go in a different direction." Nolan gestured toward the dining room. "Could we sit for a few minutes? There's something I'd like to clarify." She looked at Petra, at Felix with his leather folder, at Nolan in his good coat standing calmly, in the middle of a room she believed she had the right to be the authority in. "Is this about the lease?" she said. Among other things. They sat. Gabriel had retreated to the kitchen, though Nolan could see him standing near the pass-through window. He didn't blame him. The morning had taken on the particular quality of moments people later describe in detail to others. Petra opened her folder. Felix set his on the table and did not open it yet. "I should have introduced myself more thoroughly yesterday," Nolan said. He said it without irony and without satisfaction. "I hold the lease on this property through a numbered company, Whitfield Properties Inc. I am the sole director. This building has been mine for 6 years. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that contains a recalibration happening in real time. Colette said, "You own this building?" "Yes." She looked at the room around her, the brick, the timber ceiling, the bar that had been rebuilt 18 months ago to a design she had praised in a magazine interview without knowing whose name was on the drawings. "The renovation," she said slowly. "My studio drew the plans. The photographs in the portfolio you dropped yesterday include this room. The third spread, pages 11 through 14. Gabriel at the pass-through put his hand briefly over his mouth and looked away. Colette's composure held. She was practiced at composure the way people who depend on appearances are always practiced at composure. Whatever the connection to the building, she said, I don't see how that changes a professional assessment. My concerns about the project were legitimate. Your concerns are noted, Nolan said. What I want to discuss is something else. He nodded toward Petra. Petra turned her folder to face the center of the table. The lease agreement, 42 pages, which Colette had signed 11 months ago, was open to Schedule C, Section 9 highlighted in 2 colors. Yellow for the Conduct Standards Clause, orange for the definition of a building affiliate, which included contractors engaged directly by the building owner. Yesterday's meeting was initiated by you, Nolan said, as a prospective client for my architectural studio. My studio is formally affiliated with this building. The conduct provision in your lease applies. You're telling me that, dropping a portfolio. I'm telling you what the clause says and what it covers. His voice had not changed temperature. There is also a section covering discriminatory conduct toward building affiliates and their personnel. That section is explicit, and what you said in that meeting, your stated concerns about whether someone with my background had the relevant experience for a project at this level, is documented. I took notes immediately after the meeting, as did my studio lead, who was not present but who I briefed. My attorney has reviewed everything. Colette was quiet. Her hands were flat on the table. I have 2 options to offer you, Nolan said. He waited. She said nothing. The first is that I engage the conduct clause formally. My attorney proceeds, the lease is reviewed for early termination, and the anniversary event does not take place on this property. Colette's jaw tightened. You can't cancel my event. I can, actually. The clause gives me the right to do that. Sandra has confirmed it this morning. He didn't gesture toward Felix. He didn't need to. The second option is that we resolve this directly. Full acknowledgement, in writing, of the conduct violation. Compensation to my studio for the preparation time invested in the presentation. Farida spent 2 days on that portfolio, and a formal apology to her, which she will receive in whatever format she prefers. A door opened at the back of the restaurant. A woman came through it, not a server, not kitchen staff. It was Farida herself. She had not been told to come. She had driven by, she would say later, because she had wanted to see the room again with fresh eyes, before she decided whether to stay at the studio. She had let herself in through the side entrance she had used 100 times during the renovation. She had not known Nolan was here. She stood at the edge of the dining room, reading the room in 3 seconds the way architects read rooms. Colette turned to face her. Something shifted in Colette's expression, not immediately, but genuinely, in the way that genuine things usually arrive late and quietly. Is she the one who made the portfolio? Colette asked. She did the majority of the work, Nolan said. Farida came forward. She didn't look at Nolan for direction. I spent 2 days on that presentation, she said. Not because the deadline required it, because the project was worth it. The bar installation is actually a beautiful problem. A pause. I knew what room I was presenting before we arrived. I didn't think it would matter. Colette looked at the bar she had described in the magazine interview as the detail that had made the room feel complete. Then she looked at the table and then, more slowly, at Nolan. I want to know, she said, what made you think you could walk into my restaurant and… She stopped. She heard herself. The sentence had nowhere good to go from where it had started, and she was intelligent enough to recognize it. She was quiet for a moment. Your restaurant, Nolan said gently, is in my building. What happened next took about 7 minutes. Colette sat very still for most of it. Felix, who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, turned his folder to face her. Petra walked her through the Schedule C provisions without editorializing. Nolan said nothing more than was required. There was no dramatic moment. There was no escalation. There was simply the particular experience of a person who had moved through the world, assuming a certain kind of account, finding that the account had been run differently than they believed. Gabriel had come fully out of the kitchen by now. He was standing near the service station with the specific posture of someone who is trying to seem like they are not listening while absolutely listening. 2 other front-of-house staff had drifted in from the back, apparently summoned by instinct. Nolan was aware of them. Colette was not. When Petra finished, Colette looked at Nolan directly. How long do I have to decide? I'd suggest before the end of business today. The anniversary event is in 3 weeks. She nodded once. A small motion tightly controlled. I need a few minutes. Nolan stood. He, Petra, and Felix moved to the far end of the room, near the windows that faced the street, and let her have the table. Farida stood near the bar. She ran one hand lightly along the zinc surface the way she did sometimes in rooms she had helped build. Not possessively, just with a kind of attention. Nolan stepped beside her. You didn't have to come. I know, she said. I wanted to see it again. They stood there for a few minutes watching October light come through the windows at the angle he had calculated 18 months ago when the renovation was in permit stage, knowing that this was exactly what it would look like and wanting to confirm it. He didn't say anything else. Farida had already said what needed saying. Colette called Petra at 4:15 that afternoon. She accepted option 2. The acknowledgement was written and signed the following morning. The compensation was transferred within 48 hours. Farida received it directly, as she had requested. The apology came in a brief, precise email that was neither performative nor particularly warm, but that arrived and that said what it needed to say, including one sentence at the end that read, "Your work on this space is the reason I wanted the commission in the first place. I should have said that at the beginning instead of what I said." Farida read it twice. She showed it to Nolan without comment. He read it and handed the phone back to her. "People are capable of more than they show on the worst version of themselves," he said. "It doesn't excuse the worst version, but it's worth knowing." Farida considered this. "You're going to let her keep the space. She hasn't violated the lease beyond what we've already addressed. The rest is between her and her own accounting." The anniversary event? Nolan turned back to his drawings. "We'll do the bar installation. The problem is still worth solving." The anniversary event was held on a Thursday in November. 60 guests, candlelight, the kind of evening that reminded people why they lived in cities. The bar installation had been completed the week before. A suspended timber structure above the counter that shifted the light in the room, so that by 7 in the evening the whole space had a particular warmth to it. The kind that doesn't photograph well, but that people feel immediately when they walk through the door. Nolan was not there. He attended events when the work required it, not when the occasion did. But Farida was. Colette had invited her, not through Nolan directly. Farida had considered it for 2 days and then accepted. She stood near the bar at 9 o'clock with a glass of sparkling water, watching the light do what Nolan had calculated it would do, listening to 60 people have 60 conversations in a room she had helped imagine. A woman beside her said something about the installation and asked who had designed it. Farida said the name of the studio. The woman said she'd heard of them, said something admiring, asked if she could get a card. Farida handed her one. She didn't call Nolan until she was in her car afterwards. It was a 10-second call. "The room works," she said. "I know," he said. She drove home through the city, the streetlights moving across her windshield, the downtown lights reflecting in the lake somewhere off to the south. Behind her, in the Whitfield building on King Street West, Maison Laurent was still full of guests who were comfortable in a room and had no idea why, the way people always are when a space has been built correctly. Not noticing the design, just feeling it. That, Nolan had learned a long time ago, was the point. Not to be seen doing the work. To do the work so well that the room spoke for itself and carried the conversation forward without him in it. Some people would look at a man and see the edges of what they were prepared to believe he could build. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the most complete answer to that was simply to build something they would stand inside and praise without ever knowing his name was on the drawings. He had found over the years that this was enough. Not because recognition didn't matter, but because the building stood regardless. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. What was the moment Colette realized she had misjudged the room she was standing in? And if there's one thing to carry away from Nolan and Farida's story, it's this: the work speaks. It always does, eventually. If you're new here, subscribe. We share stories like this every week, and the next one might be the one that stays with you longest.